Okay, great. Why don't we get started? Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm Stu Wilson. I'm the CEO of Radicle. Radicle is an insights business that helps the world's leading companies better understand startups, new markets, and the future of their markets by sourcing powerful insights from market participants. We tap into the expertise of founders, former employees, investors, and other stakeholders to enable better decision-making with respect to innovation and digital transformation, from incubating new businesses and partnering with startups through making investments and acquisitions. Today, we're partnering with our friends David Horowitz and Scott Lenet of Touchdown Ventures to share their perspectives on corporate venture capital in this quite uncertain environment. This webinar is part of a series we've launched to help innovation and future-facing professionals better navigate the coming months. The next in the series will be with Alan Goldstein of P&G Ventures and Soon Stilling, head of growth at Maersk, and we'll be discussing innovation. David and Scott are co-founders of Touchdown Ventures. Touchdown manages professional corporate investment programs for partners like Kellogg's, Allegion, and Avery Dennison, amongst many others. Both David and Scott have been through multiple market cycles. David joined Comcast Ventures in 2000 and started his corporate venture capital career during the 2001 dot-com implosion. And Scott began his venture capital career in 1992 and has seen the impact of significant recessions as both an entrepreneur and a venture capital investor. David and Scott's unique experiences should inform how you think about managing startup investments through and out of a recession. And just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom. I'll bring them up during the presentation. We'll also have time for questions at the end. And also a recording of the webinar and the presentation that Scott and David will walk through will be available to all registrants. So look for that in the coming days. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to David and Scott. And thank you both for taking time to do this today.
Thanks for having us, Stu.
Great. Thank you, Stu, for organizing this webinar. Hello, everybody. I'm David Horowitz, and I'm here with Scott Lenet. Thank you for joining us today. I was going to start out with saying you probably had a lot of other places to be today, but without travel, conferences, events, sports, etc., you probably had limited options. So we're happy to have you. But in all seriousness, we hope that you and your families and friends are all safe and healthy, given this very unusual time we're in. Scott, if you want to go to our backgrounds, I think that's a good place to start on the next slide. We won't review this. Stu talked a little bit about both the background that both Scott and I have, but you can see we have extensive experience in both traditional venture capital and corporate venture capital. Really happy to be with you today to share our perspective. Moving to the next slide, Scott. You could see a lot of that experience I mentioned in VC is really on the corporate venture side. You could see this quote from our friends at Global Corporate Venturing, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with that organization, could be a great resource for you, especially for those of you who are new to the corporate venture industry. And Scott, I'll turn it over to you to start walking through some of the main part of the content today.
That sounds great. And, as Stu mentioned, we do have extensive experience during downturns, both as venture capitalists, corporate venture capitalists, as entrepreneurs ourselves. David started his VC career in a downturn, as Stu mentioned. So did I, sort of in 1992. I kind of went to my first job in venture capital. And my first boss said, "I have good news and bad news for you." And I said, "Well, tell me the bad news." And the bad news was they hadn't raised the fund yet. And I said, "Well, what's the good news?" And he said, "Well, you get to work on fundraising, and usually junior partners don't even get to do that." So I cold called 500 pension funds in my first 6 months on the job, and it was just brutal. It was the first time I ever heard the expression vulture capital, which is a term that sort of gets thrown around a lot at times like these. And we're going to spend today sort of helping to avoid hearing that term yourself. So, one of the things that we wanted to think about is whether this downturn is, sort of different or similar than prior downturns that we've been involved in. If you celebrate Passover, you may be familiar with this format of how is this one different with 4 answers. And, sort of there's some things that are in common and there's some things that are different this time. And certainly in my lifetime, this is the first one that has a public health crisis, sort of driving this type of downturn, where in addition to sort of economic implications, we also have, health and lives that actually are at risk. And we'll talk a lot about empathy, how to think about what others are experiencing. This is a really important component to keep in mind, sort of when as managing innovation programs or as venture capitalists, were deciding how to act at this time period. David, I know you want to talk about technology and the differences in today's market.
Yeah, I think this is one of the more important points. I think this may be a bit of the silver lining here that unlike some of the prior downturns, particularly if you remember the dot-com one, where a lot of the companies that ended up going under were the technology companies. And I think in this, why is this particular time period different? It's technology is really driving the economy right now. Companies like Zoom, of course, which we're on a Zoom conference, Slack, even e-commerce companies, given the challenges of going to physical stores, are thriving in this economy. I think there's big behavior change. There's obviously a number of people who maybe for the first time placed their first order on Amazon and likely will continue doing that. So I think that's really the key difference that we see here is technology is likely going to grow through this period of time as opposed to other downturns where it was less important.
And one in particular where technology was part of the cause of the downturn, sort of as opposed to part of the solution, for sure. I think, sort of two other points that are relevant, points 3 and 4, related to venture capital and corporate venture capital and innovation specifically. When I started in the business, I don't think many people in the country knew what venture capital was, and now it's completely mainstream. So, sort of the movie, The Social Network, explaining, sort of how Facebook, sort of grew and ultimately went public, happened after the last downturn. And I think that in the past decade, we've seen, sort of the rise of venture capital bloggers and, sort of more classes that are being taught at universities. It's just a much more mainstream part of American life and global life at this point. And there's greater sophistication and maturity of this industry across the board. And we'll talk about, sort of the parts that are different for CVCs, especially, but I think in prior bull markets, it was, let's go get in on this, sort of rush for money. And sort of now we believe, and certainly it's what we're hearing from a lot of you who are on this call, from the folks that we work with at Touchdown, from some of our other friends in corporate venture capital, that there's a fundamental better understanding of why you're in this business in the first place, which means that sort of the chances of running for the exits are probably lower at this time. That doesn't, sort of mean that, some won't run for the exits, and we've seen one so far. This is also reporting from our friends at Global Corporate Venturing, who noted that DuPont, sort of our friends there, have decided that it's time to shut down the effort. The highlighting at the bottom is ours. I think this is the really important takeaway, which is there's two consequences that result from this. And the first one, sort of the polite British way of describing this is, these entrepreneurs are left somewhat in the wind, which really means that they're in trouble. And then the second part is really more for DuPont, which is that the damage to their capabilities to be innovative may be severe. And so, sort of, I think going back to that point about why corporations are engaging in venture capital, you need to be financially responsible, especially at this time. But the real reason to be in this business is in service to innovation, which is, what most of you have told us in our conversations. And then, we also believe that it's important to understand the backdrop of the signals that you're hearing from traditional venture. Sort of, I know that we have some friends on the phone who are, financial or institutional venture capitalists, and, please don't be offended, but, sort of, as a former institutional VC myself, I feel like I'm entitled to say, we have the biggest megaphone, and sometimes we can be loudmouths, and what we say actually moves the entire market. Traditional venture capitalists are 75% of the business in the United States. And so sort of as financial VC goes, so goes the rest of the industry. And understanding that backdrop is important because there is a key way that corporate venture capital is a little bit different. So that funding structure is driven by their nature as institutional entities. And what institutional means in this case is that it's the institutions or the limited partners that provide the capital for these funds. So these are pension funds, very large family offices, endowments. These are the institutions in institutional venture capital. And it's important to understand that there is a target asset allocation to venture for each of these institutions. So, my last fund was a company called DFJ Frontier, and CalPERS is our largest investor. And CalPERS has a set target for how much of their assets they want in venture. Let's say for argument's sake, it's 10%. When the stock market goes down, and what's important here is it's literally the holdings in the stock market, as a result, their allocation of venture goes up. So stock market goes down, everything else goes up as a percentage. And so now instead of being at that 10% target, they might be at 12% or 13% in venture. And so that becomes a problem because they look at that and say, well, I need to get back to my target of 10%. And if venture capitalists would all mark down their portfolios immediately, then those targets would actually be the same. But of course, that's not the behavior that happens. Audits happen once a year. And I think everyone is concerned with not looking bad in this environment. And of course, we don't really know exactly what the valuations are for each company in real time. So what happens is that these limited partners will signal back to the traditional VCs that the next fund might be slow or it might not be happening at all. And usually the priority is if you're a new fund that's never had capital from that LP, they'll say, we're not doing that in this environment. If you're an existing manager that they work with, they might say, listen, there's a big line for the next fund, and it might be later than you think. And so then that in turn causes traditional VCs to slow down, which is rational. One of the other things that we'll talk about is how to assess the syndicate. And you may be facing a situation where more of the capital for your existing portfolio companies has to come from your own fund. That has to come from somewhere. And it usually comes from new deals, and then that in turn translates into slowing down. So, as I mentioned, this means you're going to set the tone for the rest of the market, and that tone, sort of may be a combination of, hey, we're slowing down, or guess what, we're still doing deals and we're really proud of it. And sometimes those signals can be confusing. What's important is that this model is not what affects corporate venture capital firms. And so, sort of most corporate VCs are sole LP with the parent corporation providing the capital, and typically that comes from cash. And so this asset allocation rebalancing is not a factor for CVCs, and you have to recognize that you're fundamentally operating from a different capital base and that you can be making different decisions. While you still want to stay in lockstep with your partners on deals that you're in, you sort of have to recognize that you haven't destroyed your ability to play in this market, and that there may be an opportunity not only to defend what you have, but also to go on offense. I had a conversation this week with Scott Kupor, who runs Andreessen Horowitz. A lot of you may know him. He wrote this great book called Secrets of Sand Hill Road. And the first quote is a comment that he made a couple months ago in January at a conference. He was up on stage, and he said, if you asked financial investors 10 years ago about CVCs, they probably would have said, keep them out of your deals. This is what sort of my partners at DFJ used to say to me when we started the Frontier Fund in 2002. And then he said, but the relationships are much better now. And then this week, he added two more other things, and he said, we're going to find out in this current environment if CVCs are truly long-term committed or if this was just the product of another bull market. And then, kind of showing that he's actually rooting for all of us, said, I think these are real efforts. And I think that market forces, which is to say the need for innovation, really require corporations to engage in venture capital. And what's important for all of us to recognize is that sort of traditional VCs are the majority of the business, and they are watching how we behave at this time, right? We're under pressure. How do we conduct ourselves? David?
Great. So we broke up some of the guidance here around established and new CVC programs, knowing some of you that are participating have been operating a CVC for some time, and some of you are either just getting started or are thinking about starting one. So you'll see how we broke that up. So we'll start with the established, and really our top takeaway, if you go to the next slide, Scott, is really prioritizing the portfolio. Think of this as what you've already invested in. As Scott mentioned before in the Andreessen Horowitz comment with Scott Kupor, your reputation's at stake here. And I think, especially in this economy, this is an area we always say corporates can bring more than just capital to the table. And this is a good opportunity in a likely scenario where some of the startups might actually be reducing some of their sales and marketing. This is a great opportunity for corporates to step in and maybe even provide potentially some of those resources or support or assistance. And so, again, I think this is an area where we can prove the industry that corporates can provide more than just money to the table. You go to the next slide, Scott. So the other piece is new investments. And I think you could read the text here, and a lot of us know this from that have been in the venture industry for a while, that obviously valuations tend to go down, and we'll talk about that later in this presentation, and that can make this a very attractive time to make new investments. In a lot of ways, this is a great time to start a new fund, especially if you don't have a portfolio and you're not spending a lot of time focusing on that. And but here I think the key takeaway is the title, which says scrutinize new investments, because funding rounds are definitely going to change. And we'll talk about this more in the presentation, but things like monitoring cash runway, how much cash does this company have? And things like, who are your co-investors? Are they in this for the long term as well? Are they going to keep supporting the company? Are really important. We've seen this in prior downturns, and they're going to be extremely important in this downturn. And, you know, again, I think we always look for silver linings, especially in a bad time. We talk about how technology is important, and there's another silver lining in the next two slides. And one of them is that some great companies were founded in prior recessions. Just even in the last recession, companies like Uber and Airbnb, as an example, were two of the most promising companies started in that 2008, 2009 period of time. And you could see some of the other ones. And it's probably a good segue for your next slide, Scott, that talks about the Kauffman Foundation study.
Yeah, probably a lot of you have read these articles, or seen the stat showing that 57% of the 2009 Fortune 500 was founded in a recession or a bear market. But we wanted to go one level deeper. This is actually going to be a topic of ongoing research for us at Touchdown. And we said, well, is that a reasonable expectation? Maybe 57% of the companies are also founded during a recession or a bear market. And it turns out that's not true. Turns out that 31% of the time up until 2009, we're in a recession, and then 69% of the time we're in an expansion, and that companies are founded at an equal rate during recessions and expansion. So you really see the extent to which the recessions punch above their weight class in terms of the ability to produce companies that endure. And so I think, again, we're going to do a bit more research in here. It seems like there's a big difference between pre and post-war, the way recessions were even defined. So we'll look for more research and articles from us on this topic. But we thought that these stats were pretty interesting by themselves. So let's talk about the existing portfolio. Again, this is the idea of playing defense, taking care of what you have first. I like to use the analogy that making an investment in a startup is a little bit like bringing a puppy home. And everybody thinks that's a great thing, and how much fun for the kids, and the kids promise that they're going to feed the dog and walk the dog. And what quickly turns out to be the case is the kids don't do any of those things, and the parents wind up taking care of it. And the dog is pooping on the neighbor's lawn, and you got to clean it up. And that's kind of our view about these portfolio companies. It's not a right, it's not a privilege, it's an obligation that you signed up for. And that, as we mentioned, empathy is a huge component of this business, and especially at this time. And they're going to be looking to us. We'll get to what they might be thinking, but they're definitely looking for our leadership. They're looking for our communication. And that's one of the most important things we want you to take away from this webinar. So we've sort of broken the two main sections that David described, existing portfolio and new opportunities, into three sort of subcomponents: what to expect, what others are probably thinking, and what you might think about doing yourself. So let's start with what to expect. Again, in this environment, we believe that everyone's slowing down, the belt tightening, whether it's proactive or because your limited partners have said, you shouldn't go as fast, is going to lengthen overall funding cycles for every deal, whether it's a new investment or an existing portfolio company. And that's just a reality that all startups and all venture capitalists should be prepared for. Obviously, we've got to sort out that signal to noise. Those who are bragging that they're still issuing term sheets and investing today may slow down next week or next month. And so we have to be prepared for those conditions to change and really understand who these syndicate partners are and what they're capable and likely to do. This next point is related to terms, and so we'll talk a little bit more about valuation. And there's a difference between valuation and terms here. So, we believe that there's definitely going to be a valuation reset. We've seen some surveys on that that indicate both entrepreneurs and venture capitalists believe this and are already seeing it. And then there's some extra terms where I'll call this the knives come out, and these can look like they're investor friendly. I think this is an area where corporate venture capitalists have really hurt their reputations in the past. We still are in a business where we need mutually beneficial deals, not just on the commercial side, which we'll talk about, but also on the venture investments themselves. And this is not the time to kick someone while they're down. In my experience, when somebody sticks a 3x participating preferred liquidation preference on, where we're really squeezing the life out of the startup, those things rarely turn into a good outcome. At a certain point, the entrepreneurs will hand the company back to us and say, you know what, this isn't worth my time anymore. You own the company, you deal with it. And, sort of generally speaking, investors, sort of are not supposed to be operators. We only want to be running these companies in the most dire situations, and it's not a situation we want to create ourselves. So you sort of recognize that some of these terms may look attractive, but exercise caution. David, I know you're sort of particularly passionate about this idea of preparing in advance and kind of monitoring your revenue and cash versus your expenses.
Yeah, no, I think this is really important. This is, frankly, even in a good economy, we try to train people here at Touchdown about looking at cash, and cash is king and cash runway. I think in this environment, this idea of scrutiny is even more important, especially with your portfolio companies. And someone needs to be the one around the table challenging, in a very nice way, the entrepreneurs to make sure that they're not overly optimistic. Because the worst thing you can be is overly optimistic. And it's not only whether you're going to get that business or retain the business, but when are you going to collect the cash, given the environment we're in right now. So those are all the things that you need to challenge the startup companies. And some of the guidance, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later in the presentation, is 24 months of cash runway would certainly make me feel the most comfortable. Obviously, you can make a case for 18 or more than 24, but when you go down to, okay, we have 6 months of cash left, that's a big concern, especially in this environment and what we expect with the decrease of funding activity.
Yeah, if there's a time to avoid self-delusion, it's a downturn. So this is where you really need to, as David said, in a nice way, follow up with these entrepreneurs. And then this last thing to expect, I think, for those in the corporate environment is, your own organization may be having issues, and it may become more conservative. It may ask for more justification than, sort of in a bull market. And this is something that you need to be prepared to report back on. So now let's talk about, sort of what others, particularly the entrepreneurs and your traditional VC co-investors might be thinking. And this is where, as I mentioned, this is the Andreessen Horowitzes and others of the world are watching to see what we do, because in the prior cycles, corporations have taken their hand off the wheel and said, I'm out. And that's not a good thing to do. That's viewed as abandonment, and there is a rational concern that they have from prior experience with hands on the hot stove, whether we're going to be there at this time when they need us the most. They're probably worried about their own situations. As I mentioned, the venture capital funds may be wondering when their next fund can arrive. If they've just raised a new fund, that's great, but many may not have. And there's a poll that just popped up in the middle of the screen. I'm going to move it out of the way. Especially for the entrepreneurs, they're really worried about their cash position and the viability of their business. And so, there's a double whammy here. If you're an entrepreneur, not only is your baby in jeopardy, but you've also got the issue where the health of, sort of you, your family, your people may be in jeopardy. So, sort of there's extra tension compared to a normal downturn. And that, means that they're more scared than we are. So, sort of generally, if someone winds up having to leave a corporation, there's usually severance. There's usually warning. These corporations have cash, sort of the vast majority of them. They're much more stable entities than a startup. And so when it comes to summoning the empathy, the entrepreneurs are probably much more scared than sort of anyone who's participating in this webinar. So what does this mean in terms of what you should do? There's a lot of connection, communication, coordination that sort of in our mind are really the definition of leadership, whether you're technically the leader or not. Step one, connect with every single one of the portfolio company CEOs and every single one of your co-investors. Right? This is about understanding where are you, what do you need, how can I help? As much as that's a joke on Twitter, it's a great Twitter account making fun of venture capitalists. But the reality is this is the time for us to do that. And even if you're not the chairperson, you can just sort of take the lead in helping to coordinate if the chairperson of that company is not doing it. To the extent that you can, communicate that you're prioritizing support for your existing investments because there may be some frazzled nerves. Don't overpromise. Don't tell them that you've got money coming if it's not coming. But to the extent that you can say that you have a budget for this time to support existing portfolio companies, say that. To the extent that you can't make that promise, say that you're prioritizing helping the portfolio however you can, and then make good on that promise. You need to know the numbers, right? And so this is where not just the CEOs, but also the CFOs need to be key contacts to the extent that there are CFOs. Someone is responsible for the numbers at each of these portfolio companies, and it's time to make sure that you have a direct line to them, that you are understanding how much cash they have, what's going to happen if revenue is reduced, preparing for different scenarios, and knowing when this business is going to be out of cash so that there's no surprises. And then you need to go back and revisit your reserves for each of these deals. So, we believe it's a best practice to evaluate reserves on a quarterly basis. If you're not doing it, it's a good time to do it now. And then, to the extent that you have a choice, are on the side of supporting these entrepreneurs. But again, self-delusion is not helpful at this time. And this is where everyone needs to be asking themselves, sort of really hard questions. Is this investment doing what it's supposed to? Is this company actually had any chance of surviving this downturn? And if the answer is no, figure out how to help the people as best you can, but don't put good money after bad. Again, we talked about the idea, this is not the time to be predatory. I mentioned vulture capital, which often comes out of these downturns. And, my definition of what makes a vulture is preying on the weak or helpless. And so, if you have angel investors who are out of money and, maybe did it personally and they're not actually wealthy, if you have a fund that's in year 15 and has no reserves, that's your co-investor, don't do things that, sort of harm them just because you can at this moment. And again, back to David's point on the prior couple slides, the expenses are the only part of this that's under the control of the startups. So, they can't necessarily control what happens with their customers. They need to be great listeners, right? They need to talk to the customers and understand where they are. And odds are good, the customers are going to ask at minimum for slow paying. So, you need to have them prepared for multiple scenarios and to be prepared to cut decisively if the facts warrant. So, David, I don't know if you want to talk about commercial deals.
Yeah, I alluded to this before, just in terms of, looking to ways that you could bring more than just money to the table. And again, I think that sitting down, with each of the startups and this whole, what can we do to bring more capital to the table? One thing I'll just add here, which I think just might be a good summary for this particular slide, is I think Scott's kind of alluded to this, is looking at your portfolio, ranking it by cash out dates. So the companies that have the least cash should get your most important attention because they're the likely ones that have a higher likelihood of failure rate right now. And again, really diving in and really getting your whole venture team behind the companies. So if you haven't done a portfolio review, we'd urge you to do that immediately. You probably need to gather that information that Scott wrote in the first bullet point there to have that portfolio review first.
Right. And then, again, your own organization may seem like an impediment at times. You have to be prepared for that. You have to be willing to do it. So, this is really all the defense that we talked about. It's, you're responsible for the things that you're already responsible for. Don't bring a new pet home until you've taken care of the pets that you have. Again, there still has to be some upside. Don't delude yourself about whether a company is actually viable. One of the questions that we're getting a lot in this environment, and I published an article on this week, that's there's going to be on the last page. There's a few that we published recently with links that Stu is going to be distributing. But what's happening to valuations? What's the timing on valuation? Will there be a market lag? Sort of how should you think about this? And our attitude is that, the valuations are already going down. We've seen this in surveys from VCs and entrepreneurs, and it may have gone down and you just don't know it yet. And there's a couple of tests that you can apply. We believe that it's generally irrelevant whether the overall market is going down, because what you generally care about is an individual company or the collection of companies that make up your portfolio. So the three-part test are these questions. If the company has enough cash that they can get through this crisis, then they don't have to go test the market, and the paper valuation may not change. Obviously the trick there is we don't really know how long this crisis will last, so that's a tough question to answer. Second question is, do existing investors, insiders, have the both ability and willingness to fund the startup? Again, if it doesn't have to approach the open market, there may not be a need to reset the valuation. And if the answer to that question is no, then the third question is, well, if you do have to approach the open market, are you a winner? We saw the funding for Notion at a $2 billion valuation last week. And, one question is, well, how can that be happening if valuations are going down? And, the answer is, well, it's a winner, right? It's buoyed by this environment. And so they're able to attract new investment in an up round, even this environment. I think we believe that valuations will probably get worse, not better, as time goes on. So to the extent that you can shore up the balance sheet of a particular portfolio company of yours, try to do it sooner rather than later. So, moving on to new opportunities, as David mentioned earlier, this can be the most attractive time to start a new fund or make new investments. Again, forming expectations. Some of this is a little bit repeat, but you may see, sort of deals that look, tantalizingly attractive in terms of the actual terms or the term sheet of what's in the deal. And just be careful. If you're taking advantage of an entrepreneur, that's probably not going to wind up working out, and it may come back to harm your reputation. We call that a Pyrrhic victory. Again, we talked about valuation a minute ago. These are almost certainly going to fall. Typically, there's a lag, partially because of the factors that we talked about in the last slide. And sort of think about who's going to be honest with you. So, CVCs have been viewed as dumb money in the past. And I think we've spent the last decade trying to claw back that reputation, and to, Scott Kupor's comments probably to good effect. But these are desperate times. Entrepreneurs are probably going to act more desperately than VCs, right? Venture capital is a long-term business. Many of you who are on this call, have relationships that are, half a decade or a decade or longer with other VCs. And, it's harder to fib to people like that. So when you're, sort of doing your diligence on a deal, obviously don't talk just to the entrepreneur, talk to the VCs and sort of get the honest answer to how things are really going. Again, we talked about this idea that the most successful startups are often born during this time, and so it's actually a good time to think about going on offense if you have the means to do it. And then again, recognize your own organization may do exactly what we've been saying on this webinar, which is take care of what you already own first. The implication may be deprioritizing new opportunities. If you have the ability to do both, you should. But again, take care of what's already in your house. So what others might be thinking in this environment is pretty similar to sort of what you'll experience when thinking about your existing portfolio, with a slight twist. And so again, this idea of abandonment and reliability is going to be top of mind for a lot of traditional investors and entrepreneurs, and that's fear. But the flip side of that is for a deal where someone is saying, I also think this is a good time to start a company or fund a company, and there's going to be less competition, lower costs, sharper focus, things like that. A corporate investor who can bring a commercial relationship might be just the thing we need to help this company emerge as the winner during this time. And so the flip side of the fear is obviously the greed side. And so that part of the brain may be active at this time, and recognize that too. And again, sort of even with that in mind, desperation may be in play. And so some of them might be thinking that they can fool you into funding them, so don't forget to do your diligence. What does that imply? It goes back to the idea, and we'll sort of wrap up with this, but remembering, why did you get into corporate venture capital in the first place? It's about preparing for the future. And, there's some companies that have such existential threats that they may not be around in a decade, but if you plan for your company to be around in a decade, you still need to prepare at least with part of your brain for that reality. And so the insights that come from having a corporate venture program are essential to helping prepare for the future. And that means reviewing lots of deal flow, staying in the market. One of the specific pieces of advice is if you may not be able to count on other investors as much in this environment, you probably need to increase your ratio of reserves on a per deal basis, which might mean fewer new deals. And so you should look at your portfolio model, which hopefully you have. Selectivity, right? Thorough diligence, more important than ever. And as David said, you really want to think about the cash runway. 2 years is probably ideal, but certainly you want to plan for an environment where it's hard to raise money from anyone else new, which also implies companies that are cash efficient, sort of resilient business models where they can actually keep and retain their customers. The syndicate partners should be reliable. All of these things are much more important than they are in an environment where cash is flowing more freely. And this is sort of another corollary to the idea that sort of terms may change in this environment. Sometimes there's a fundamentally good company and the cap table is all messed up, and it may need to be recapitalized at this time. You can make enemies when you do this, so it has to be something that everybody wants. You really need to be cautious about going down this path. Again, you don't want to be viewed as a vulture or wrecking your reputation. And then, again, if your own organization is slowing down, the commercial relationship, the commercial transaction may be the way to begin a relationship with a startup that you might want to fund. David, I know you have more thoughts on this too.
Yeah, no, I think this is probably one of the most important pieces of guidance here, which is especially if have been focused more on the financial aspects of venture capital over the past several years. And for example, if your corporation has given you guidance that they want to slow down for reasons given what's going on in the economy, then if all you can do is make an investment in a company and your corporation wants to slow you down, you're not very valuable. So this is a great opportunity where you can demonstrate, again, to Scott's point earlier, generating those insights or commercial relationships. And so if you've already been doing it, just keep doing what you're doing. And if you haven't been doing it, we strongly urge you to start thinking about that. And Scott will point to some articles that we've written, but at the end of the presentation. But we have a lot of good thought pieces on how to generate strategic value to a corporation that we're happy to discuss with anybody.
And Sean, I see your question about sort of across the funds that Touchdown works with. I would say 80% are still actively looking to make new investments right now. Again, you may have to jump through hoops internally. Be prepared to do that. Sort of to the extent that your organization has the resources, be prepared to go on offense, and take care of hot burning fires first. So again, I think we just wanted to wrap up with this idea that I can't think of a single corporation that we work with that hasn't said we want to be around in a decade. Usually the time frame is kind of commensurate with how long the businesses have already been in existence. We work with a lot of companies that are 50, 100 years old or more, and they say things like, we want to be around in the next 50 years, and we're thinking about how to make sure we have enough long-term planning happening, and venture's part of that. So if you are making that justification internally, go back to those original premises. They're still just as valid as they were, if not even more valid at a time like this. Again, Stu will distribute these slides so that you have our contact info. And here are those articles that we mentioned. These are live links. A couple of topics. There's an article version of what we just went through. There's an article version of the valuation discussion in a little more detail. There's an article version of the backdrop for target asset allocation rebalancing. And then there's one on 5 business development transaction structure templates that you can use to work together with your portfolio or with prospective portfolio companies.
Scott, I just want to make one final point here, which is a word that you used throughout the presentation that I just want to emphasize, which is a word that you've been hearing a lot from me at Touchdown, which is empathy. And I think this is really important. And we think about empathy in a couple of ways. But first and foremost, we think about having empathy for people, especially in this environment where people are working from home and are balancing things like childcare and their jobs. We need to have patience. The second thing, with empathy is our portfolio companies. And this is a great opportunity, as Scott said, where we can really stick it to these companies and negotiate hard, whether it's in a financial negotiation or commercial negotiation. And I think being friendly and being nice and not even though you can be, having that empathy is important. And the last one is just with the corporation, arguably the most important, because they likely are paying your salary or your bill depending on your relationship with them. And again, in a case where some of the corporations are having that I'm sure all of us working with are having real core issues with their core business, whether it's related to supply chain or just not being able, in the travel and hospitality industry, have customers at all. How can we help these companies in this crisis in the short term? Are there particular, probably through technology, because as we stated, that's the one silver lining here. And so that's the challenge that I would give to everybody. How can you make a difference in the short term, probably with technology or innovation, to demonstrate, the corporate venture program or corporate venture fund is delivering value in this time of crisis.
Yep. All right, well, let's turn to the Q&A. We've got a good 15 minutes, if that works for you, Stu. And,
yep.
Obviously take the lead, but I see the questions and we could just start taking them.
Sure. Well, I've got a bunch of questions that came in over email that we can start with. And the first one actually builds on David's point about corporate venture and innovation outfits having bosses, that being the parent organization. As those firms may retrench or look to focus on the core, like any best practices or recommendations for managing your budget holder?
Yeah, David, you want to talk about goal setting? Hopefully you're not trying to start from scratch now, but go ahead and I'll pile on.
Yeah, I think this question, I'm sure others, is going to be similar to what I wrote before, which is, are you just strictly all you're doing is making investments, or do you have a dual purpose of trying to bring, call it strategic value, impact, whatever you want to call it, to the corporation? And a big framework that we use that we've talked about, it's not on this slide that Scott has, but we have another blog post about it, which is developing, strategic goals and KPIs of how do you measure whether you're driving that strategic impact. And so, we feel organizations that are doing that are following that are, where commercial deals maybe bring other revenue are likely to, continue to justify their existence. And again, in an environment where if all you can do is write a check and be a financial VC. Now, it's a great time to be, we think it's going to be a great time, but if there are core business issues, I think those are the types of organizations that might be at bigger risk right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first part of what we do with our corporate partners at Touchdown, is to make sure we understand the goals and what would be delivering impact. We're very fond of the Chinese proverb that the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago, and the second best time is today. So hopefully you have not waited until today to have goals for your corporate venture arm, but if you haven't, there's no time like the present. And the way to manage your bosses is to say, how do we make sure that this corporate venture program is actually doing things that matter to the parent, and define it, and go not just from understanding the big picture goals of the corporation, but then saying, here's how that will be reflected in the activities of the venture arm, whether it's commercial relationships or the types of investments you're focusing on, the stages, whether it's core, adjacent, or disruptive in its nature, and then translate that into metrics that you can say, we're going to measure ourselves on these things, and we're going to report on it not on a 10-year basis or a 5-year basis, but on an annual basis and a quarterly basis. And if you didn't do it yet, do it right away.
Right. Scott, you mentioned being a helpful partner in this time. If people on the call have portfolio companies, but they're not on the board, what are some of the best ways that they can be helpful partners right now?
Yeah, I mean, communication is definitely the first one, and you don't have to be on the board to reach out and talk to people. And folks aren't traveling; they have more time for video calls, and to say, hey, I'm checking in. Can we schedule a 15-minute video call to talk about what's going on with this company, so that we can stay coordinated with each other? We haven't had anybody say, no, I won't make time for that. And so you don't have to be, I think this is the difference between, kind of leadership or influence and authority. You don't need authority to be effective and to be helpful. Right.
And David, this builds on a little of what we talked about on our call that we wrote up for our newsletter this week, about the benefits of corporate venture capital to a parent company. So one of the questions is, if my company is going to cut growth investments, what's the argument that corporate venture should be protected relative to other investment options?
Yeah, we covered this a little bit, as you mentioned in the interview. I think our philosophy is, corporate venture is about innovation, and there's only two ways to innovate. You can innovate inside your corporation or outside. And so, having all of your eggs in one basket in internal innovation seems a little silly, especially, given all of the success we've seen from startup companies that have grown. And quite frankly, even if you do have an internal innovation bias, you should even have a sense of what's happening outside of your four walls, which is a whole other conversation. So I think the thesis we have is, look, if you care about external innovation, and I wrote a blog about this, venture capital is really the best way of doing that, because it creates a process to source and diligence and filter and ultimately transact and manage a portfolio of external innovation startup partnerships. So I think you have to, again, separate out that investment is one of many things you can do through a venture program. We talked about insights and intelligence, commercial relationships. Could be venture. We've had this happen with some of our corporate partners where started as a venture investment and became very strategic, and a corporation decided to acquire the company. That certainly can happen. So we think of it as a funnel for external innovation. And so unless you're shutting off external innovation, which I think would be a mistake, then you shouldn't shut off corporate venture capital is our thesis.
Got it. And then David, maybe you could talk about your experience at Comcast Ventures during 2000 and 2001, which presumably was a tough time for, at that point, I guess, a cable business, but for lots of businesses that were involved in media and technology. Any experiences from that time stand out as valuable for people doing business today? Maybe investments that were made during that period that turned out to be value creators for Comcast?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I mean, I think 2001 was a very difficult year. And, if you look at the funding in 2000, 2001, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it was a huge, probably a significantly lower amount of funding. So, and I think what we saw, companies that might not have even given us the time of day, and we're seeing that right now, even in this economy, because they had plenty of people that were courting them, are now a lot more interested in corporates. Again, this mindset of, I think I need an investor that can do more for me than just bringing capital to the table. So we saw a lot of examples. I think with respect to Comcast in particular, Comcast was in a fortunate position because at that particular period of time, broadband penetration was growing. Comcast, being a cable modem provider, was a big provider of broadband. So we actually shifted our strategy at the time, and we had done a lot of .com investing and realized that that was probably not the best place to invest in 2001. Started investing in a lot of companies that were building a lot of the technology for the kind of broadband and backbone infrastructure for Comcast. And some of those companies, whether they be on the home networking side or, one of the companies that we invested in helped Comcast launch a voice over IP business, which became a $1 billion business for Comcast. So I think, looking at very specific companies that had technology that could help Comcast grow was the approach we took, and that was very successful.
Got it. I think over the last, at least through this cycle, there's been a move to staying private longer, late stage. Private capital markets are much bigger than they were in the past. Do you think that in this downturn, you might see an M&A cycle pick up? And should we be having more conversations with our portfolio companies about potential strategic exits and beginning those conversations?
Yeah, I think so very much. I mean, frankly, I think there's a point of pride here for venture capitalists and entrepreneurs that gets in the way of doing this in all markets. And, pride tends to go away a little bit during these times. But, when I started in this business, any one company I funded might have, 4 or 5 competitors in the world. And that made it a fundamentally easier proposition to compete. And now there's probably 50 or 100 funded competitors in any decent space. And so, I always say, this is probably the title of a future blog, but, it's a little bit like the Hunger Games. And what are your chances of emerging as the winner from that? Not everyone can be Katniss Everdeen. And so more of these companies need to be teaming up and cooperating and not, sort of beating each other's brains out using the capital of all these different venture capital firms. But you have really practical problems like who's going to be the CEO and who's going to be on the board. And there's a lot of ego that gets in the way of doing these things that, if you might not exist, well, that ego tends to melt away and you have a better chance of doing it. And so somebody asked that question in the Q&A, and I replied in writing. I think the Foursquare Factual merger this week is a really good example. And I think we're going to see many of these, and we should. Teaming up is a way to survive this downturn. So we're strongly in favor of that in any market, but especially in this type of market.
Great. Let's see. I mean, we have some other questions here. I don't know if you want to, if there are any in the Q&A that you haven't spoken to yet. Some of the questions we've gotten also relate more generally, I think, to corporate venture capital. And here's one maybe that you can think about as we look for some other questions on the environment currently. What are best practices for ensuring that a corporate venture capital program is in sync with the organization, but also has the right level of independence from it?
Yeah, I mean, David, I'm interested to hear your answer, but I think we have a tendency to believe that independence from the parent corporation is probably more of a negative than a positive. Sort of your corporate parent is your greatest superpower. Why would you want to be far away? This is the way in which you can help your portfolio companies. And if you're not walking the halls and sort of making sure you have really tight relationships, then your ability to deliver value is minimized. What you want to avoid is allowing your corporate parent to slow you down or to make you sort of act in ways that are out of sync with the traditional venture market. So when, at Touchdown, when we help a corporation design their program, we really think about, well, how is that investment committee structured? Where are the definitions of what's in scope for the fund? And I think, Brian Christian, you asked this question about, wouldn't you want to reconsider your CVC portfolio or maybe your approach to what's in scope? You should. And one of the great privileges of having your own corporate fund where your parent company is the sole LP is you can change that strategy frequently, whereas in a traditional venture fund, that's a once every 5-year event when you raise a new fund. So, I think staying in sync is essential. Just don't have the design of how you make investment decisions or how you diligence deals be sort of so bureaucratic that you're unable to act. I think those are the two best practices that kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and I would just add, I just think this communication point of, to your point, Stu, staying in sync is really important. And so best practice that we see, that Scott alluded to a little bit, is when we launch a new fund, try to actually meet with as many executives and other key stakeholders within the organization, understand, what are things that are really important to them. And maybe it's related to their MBOs for the year, maybe just the passion points, but also probably tells us which people within the organization are more likely going to be, friendlier to work with or more engaged with the venture program. But in this particular time of crisis, if you did this, say, a year ago or even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, it's probably a really good time to go back. And that's what we're doing right now at Touchdown with some of the corporations we work with, is you're going back and redoing these interviews. And again, at this point of, what are some short-term things that we could be doing that help support the business in this time of crisis? Again, I think that's what all corporate venture funds should be doing right now, is having those conversations.
Great. And maybe last question. Let's say you haven't launched a corporate venture effort yet, but you've been considering it. Any perspectives on how to build a case for that in this environment? And I think this speaks to some of the things you spoke about earlier in the presentation, but how would you build a case for starting a corporate venture effort in the middle of recession?
David, you want to go ahead and then I'll wrap up?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, just being repetitive, I'll make the point again about, this is, maybe the word venture capital investing will roll some eyebrows. So I think, again, the right framework might be external innovation. And we need a program to know what's happening outside of our four walls. We need a process, and here is the way we could do that. And, that might be a better way of positioning it or framing it. But I think, overall, Stu, I would say, look, Scott mentioned, the companies that have been started in some of these past, downturns and recessions. I think our other co-founder, Rich, made a good point when he was doing his research and showed a lot of good corporate VC programs were started in these, such as, I think most recently, Salesforce and Google, which I think were 2 of the top 5 most active corporate venture investors, started this and probably had some early successes and wins during those periods. So I know those are some of the things I would talk about and some of the precedents I would draw when making the argument. But I'm sure Scott has other pearls of wisdom here.
I completely agree with everything that David just said. And, the other thing that I would say is critical, which definitely we've learned in the 6 years that, we've been operating, or almost 6 years that we've been operating Touchdown, is really to focus on the why instead of the what. I think, when David and Rich and I started Touchdown, we thought that we were really going to be focused on corporate venture, and that's what corporations wanted, which is, someone to help them launch and run professional venture capital programs. And what we discovered is, venture capital, which we knew, venture capital is a tool. It's part of your innovation toolkit. It's not the only tool. We're not saying we should use it exclusively at the extent, to the detriment of all your other tools like M&A or business development or even R&D, but that this is a way to supercharge some of those other things, and that the rate at which you're out looking around in the market, venture capitalists have a specific skill set that makes them, in our opinion, better than people who do those other, sort of corporate development functions. And so if you can focus on the why as opposed to the what, this isn't about venture capital. It's about survival. It's about being relevant 10, 20, 50 years from now. That's why I think corporations would take it seriously at this time.
Great. Fantastic. Well, on that note, and also my son who's crying tells me that it's 3 o'clock and time for us to wrap this up. I just want to thank David and Scott for participating in this, for sharing their insights, and hopefully you all have gotten as much value out of this as I have. A reminder that we'll make a recording of the webinar as well as the presentation that David and Scott shared available to all registrants. So expect that in your inbox, I guess, in the next few days. And then look out for an invitation to our webinar with Alan Goldstein of P&G Ventures and Soon Stilling of Maersk later in April. And have a great day. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Stu.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Stu. We hope everybody remains healthy and safe as well.
Yeah, likewise.
And Stu, I forgot to congratulate you at the beginning of the call on your newborn. So we know it's a busy time for your family. So thank you for doing this during probably a crazy last 10 days for you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it was worth it for me. So thank you both again. Awesome. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Great. All right.